Welcome,
Hello.
everybody. This is the Pre-Columbian Americas History Dose live stream with me, Chris, the writer-narrator of History Dose, and my brother Joe, artist, editor, and now composer. He's been composing more music,
Yeah, it's fun.
trying to
It's
find
fun.
actual instruments. I was talking with another creator, and he was like, yeah, well, if you go through... It's everybody using the same stock music stuff. So he was like, yeah, there's like 4 songs if you want indigenous American
Yeah,
stuff.
that's
It's
what I noticed with
the most
Mongols.
stereotypical
The
thing.
more specific you get in a culture, you're like, I want Mongol sounding music, I want indigenous sounding music, you're gonna get very stock stuff. They're all gonna sound the same, and everyone who's doing a history topic on that is gonna license the same music. So
Yeah. So our guest today is Rafael Mena. He is an archaeologist and illustrator who focuses a lot on Mesoamerica. So let me pull up this presentation, then I'll bring him on in 1 second. Quick shout out to some of our Patreon supporters, our upper tier guys, Benissimo, Kevin Lay, Omri, and Matthew Ochoa, and everybody else who contributes. Link to the Patreon is down below.
remember, the
And
Patreon is awesome. Oh, and this is awesome too.
one little shout out before we get started here. We're going to Ireland in 2025. I have the link down in the description, but like all the stuff you want to see in Ireland, we're hitting all the big stuff in 1 week. If it's been on your bucket list for a while, go check it out. Let me know if you want to come.
And another thing that is not obviously on the itinerary, but when we did our Mongolia trip, it's like every night we would be talking for hours and hours about history, just making friends, hanging out, looking at the stars. Like that stuff is pretty awesome too. So
Yeah.
you might make some good friends while you're out there as well.
Yeah, and a little drink in hand makes the
Little
history
drink,
talk flow a little bit
talking
easier.
about Brian Boru and the Celts and everything.
Yeah. All right. This is the pre-Columbian world. There's the thumbnail I came up with. So as I said, Rafael Mena is an illustrator and an archaeologist. I'm going to bring him on right here. We'll have his voice in the call with us.
Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you all. We already have a little intro chat, but nice to see you all. Have comments open for any questions and stuff like that. I have to join chat or something, but I think I'll just read it.
Up on the YouTube.
Yeah,
but
Chris will highlight them.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I said I've got this picture of you looking so badass up there. You're really outshining us in our wimpy logo.
I mean, very try hard, that photo, I have to say. Like I do have to admit it's extremely close. So don't take it out too seriously. But yeah,
tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started, what you do.
Right, a little intro to myself and like maybe a bit of recommendation for the viewers. Mm-hmm. I am Rafael Mena. I'm a Mexican illustrator and an archaeologist. I studied in the University of Veracruz. And actually, I was like most artists, I guess. I imagine the story might be similar with Joe, that you start early on as an artist, like drawing your little sketches, making your little Gokus and stuff like that. And as I started choosing my career path, I was always into history, military history, being, a guy, and really interested in Rome, the Crusades, and stuff like that. Because much like in the U.S. and other parts of the world, sometimes even here in Mexico or in the continental Americas, history from the region can be kind of niche. So the choice was to either be an artist and go into a career path of the arts or be a historian. And in my youth, I guess I was a bit cynical about both because I didn't think I'd be able to make it as an artist, ironically. And as a historian, I wasn't like quite sure what that would mean, like regarding work. So I ended up choosing archaeology only because like felt something. It felt like something tangible, like to really get into the topic. And as I did, I started to fall in love with the subject of Mesoamerica in particular, and the Americas in general. Started reading a lot of texts that I wasn't privy to before, and kept working on my art during the whole course. By the time I was working in my thesis dissertation, like I was starting to get commissioned work by several archaeologists and a couple of YouTubers actually. And from then on, like it's mostly just been illustrative work, working with archaeologists about history, about the Americas. I worked from like my specialty is Mesoamerica, the Aztecs in particular, but I have worked from the plains of North America to the Mississippi, the eastern woodlands, down to the arid America and Mesoamerica, to the Andes and the Amazon, and even the pre-Clovis and the Clovis people. So there is some like experience over the continental Americas. So far that's been my route thus far, and I'm hoping to keep expanding, keep learning more, keep working more, and trying to show the world the complexity and the richness, the historical richness in all aspects, from military to civic to architectural to religious, to all complexities of the Americas. So that's a bit of intro to myself.
Wonderful. Yeah, we have some questions coming in. We do have some on the YouTube comments that came in earlier when I made the community post. But I did want to touch on something that we were talking about a little bit beforehand, and I had seen some comments about just on our video, which is when we're looking at Mesoamerican, and I can speak to some of the Inca stuff here, but what sort of sources are we working with? Because people are I think some people are surprised that we can know the names of these figures that existed generations before European arrival, and formally writing down these chronicles or stories. So when you're working with Mesoamerica, what sort of sources are you working with in terms of the figures or the references, clothing, things like that?
Yeah, okay. I'm seeing a lot of questions already, and a lot of pretty contentious ones already. So we'll get to them when we get to them.
Yep.
But as to your question, like there is an actual richness of historical sources that is sometimes underappreciated, not just for Mesoamerica, but throughout the continent. And the unfortunate bit of it is that it does require a bit of contextual knowledge about each of their biases. Like with the example of, say, the Romans, for example, you have a bunch of Roman sources, and you have like a sense of their biases. Maybe Tacitus is from, I don't know, patrician class, so he's kind of rich, biased, and stuff like that. But you get the impression they're all Roman, and their texts in a very I guess kind of Western kind of, they're easy to get, I guess, is my point. Right? Whereas in the Americas, there's a richness of sources that are written, that are pictographic in nature, that are archaeological, that are from Spanish sources, that are from indigenous sources. And there is a lot to collect from. And the issue is really that between translations, some of them are indigenous in nature, like written, some are Spanish, some are only known by certain academics. So it's a tough topic to parse, but there is definitely a lot. One particular source that I brought up before we started the stream was the Crónica Mexicana, the Mexican Chronicles, which is a text written by literally an Aztec prince, which is the guy I have in my profile picture. During the colonial period, he wrote that based on interviews with actual, Aztec people that survived. Of the many that survived the war, he interviewed the many of them, used many codices, pictorial documents, some written sources that were already available from the pre-Columbian times, to tell a narrative about the rise of the Aztec Empire in excruciating detail. I've compared it before to the Homeric Iliad or to Polybius and Tacitus, in that he goes into detail about geographical locations, architecture, material culture, rituals, campaigns, political speeches, and the kind that you don't really associate, like just know about Moctezuma maybe, but you don't know necessarily about the speech that the sister city of Tlatelolco gave to Tenochtitlan when they declared war in that civil war that they had, which is something that some people don't even know. The Aztecs had a civil war, for example, and that's very, if you read it, it's very Game of Thronesy in the way it's presented, the story. The Andes has similar, it has Spanish sources that are retelling both what the conquistadors saw and are interviewing indigenous people that are giving their perspective. And although it's filtered through a Christian European lens, there's still a lot you can glean and compare with regards to material culture.
Yeah, no, so, I think one of the most fascinating sources we have, and this is where the bulk of that, in our Inca video, that sort of origin story for Pachacuti, sort of having and it does seem kind of like an ancient, maybe an Old Testament, human story where you have the jealous king who's jealous of his good son, and he wants to kill him because he's envious that he's so compassionate and wise and is a threat to the throne. And these are just these enduring human stories. And what's so interesting about the source that gives us most of that is it comes from a gentleman by the name of Juan Diaz de Betanzos. And he had married the previous wife of Atahualpa, who was then turned into a concubine of Pizarro. And he did not, as far as we can tell, he did not intend for these stories to be published. He was trying to relate the history as he had heard it from his wife and other royals there. And so you're basically getting, and it's very idealized, you're getting something that's probably very similar to the Inca royal history version of themselves. So all your kings are great guys, and Viracocha is sending heavenly warriors to help you out. And that's what's so fascinating, is that this is only a few generations removed from Pachacuti. And so we actually have something that is pretty reliable. And you have these different accounts, and you have accounts. There's another guy named Sarmiento who gives an account that he apparently had checked with 40 different Inca royals as he read them. But you can just tell from the tone of it that it is not, it's not very fair to them. So he's just constantly calling them tyrants and stuff like that. But we actually it's this really rich account where we get this, we basically get confirmation of the other stuff that we find. And so there's a general tenor to the conquest and a way that all of that proceeds. So, I think when we are, hold on, we got someone in the chat making some message. But yeah, so I think people underrate how much we can know about these cultures and these different figures. Specifically, I think in those preceding centuries before European contact. Has that been your experience, Rafa?
Yeah, there is like a subestimation. I don't know if that's a word in English, of how much how back in time the information goes with regards to American history. Like you said, it's a few generations back from the Spanish conquest, like these sources about Pachacuti and Tupac Yupanqui and so forth. We have some of that in Mesoamerica. We have a lot of that, actually. A lot of information that goes back centuries or even millennia in some cases. And obviously you have to take some of it with a grain of salt. You have to do some comparative research with archaeology, with iconography, and things of the like. But you do also have to take into account, that these oral traditions, these written memories, they do have their biases. They do have their broken phone syndrome. They also reflect like the vision of society for these people. And there is a lot to take from it, even if it's not like 100% factually reliable, right? And obviously there's like the contrast between the Spanish sources and the indigenous ones, right? Because like you said, like the Spanish writer, what was his name? The one that spoke about tyrants.
That was Sarmiento.
Sarmiento, right? There's even between the Spaniards, there's a lot of conflict, like a lot of different narratives, a lot of different perceptions of the Native Americans themselves. Like I'll give you an example. Like even between the conquistadors of Tenochtitlan, the narratives are so wildly differing, and their perception of the indigenous people is similar in the factual reality of it, but in their perception of how they lived their lives, or their level of say development, let's call it, is very different between them. Very biased, very colored by their own views of how the world works. So it's very similar around. And the topic kind of escaped from me, but I guess my point is, there is, we see that a lot in Mesoamerica and a lot of other regions from the continental Americas.
Yeah, one interesting thing is that it seemed like early in the Spanish sources, and you would have more familiarity with how this evolved in terms of contact with Mesoamerica. But early in the Spanish sources, there's kind of this idea of the indigenous people that they're coming across as kind of naive and childlike, and according to Columbus, basically without religion. And there's a bit of a motivation in the sources there to say, look, we can convert these people. They're not sort of like heathens like we were fighting over in Spain, or not heathens, but sort of people that are already enmeshed in another religion. Post fall of Tenochtitlan, is there a change in the sources there? Is there a sense that there is actually this kind of dangerous, maybe pagan religion that we need to stamp out?
Actually, I would say that the difference between the perception of the Caribbean versus Mesoamerica, which extends to the Andes as well.
Did we lose you? I wonder if his audio went out for a second.
Sorry, am I back?
Oh, yeah, you're back.
You're good.
Yep.
You just popped out for a second.
Okay. So as I was saying, like the perception of indigenous people between the Caribbean and Mesoamerica actually changes wildly. Like, when Columbus arrives to the Caribbean, to Cuba, and to the whole area, he views a people, basic chiefdoms, living hunter-gatherer societies, very simple agriculture. And his perception is somewhat ironic, I guess, of like an innocent, childlike people, which is a condescending, patronizing, which is more to justify like his own actions in the island. Obviously, like they make comments like about their appearance, about how their men are very I guess woman-like in nature. It's very patronizing, but it has a lot to do with the way they lived specifically, and there's I guess their stereotypical views of the savage, like at the time, which is very colored by their own views on savages and barbarians, and this caricature from you that's exported from Europe and brought to the Caribbean. However, once they arrive to Mesoamerica, they start encountering towns that are much more like what they were accustomed to see in Europe. People clothed in textiles and in elaborate dresses and costumes, and organized in a way that is very reminiscent to them of Europe. And that is where the narrative changes almost immediately. Because while like much is said about how the Spanish like may have viewed the Aztecs or whatever in a very negative light, they actually found kinsmen in them almost immediately, as in their cultural customs, like their perception of how of the civilization, I guess, like that they dressed, that they had a concept of shame in comparison to like the Caribbeans that spend time naked, right? To give an example, like the masculinity of their men, it's a patriarchal society, and they encounter in the Aztecs a fellow patriarchal, military, civilized, urban society, and they find a lot of parallels between them. Like, it is no wonder that they found so much common ground with the Nahuatl once they arrived to Mesoamerica, and once they started allying themselves within the political landscape of the region. And then, after the conquest is consumed, and after they start encountering the peoples from, say, the Chichimec area, the hunter-gatherers of the desert, and so forth, we come back to this narrative of the childlike, of feminine, of the hairless, even, and you see this patronizing view with priests in general, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily indigenous exclusive. Like, it's more their perception of heathens versus hereticals. Like, they see these people of the Americas as untouched by the devil to an extent. Like I don't know if that makes sense. Like, they perceived Muslims and Jews as kind of poisoned in their blood because they had been exposed to the teachings of Christ, and well, they distorted them according to the Spanish principles, right? To the Spanish friars. Not the case with the indigenous people necessarily. Like that was a dogma. So there was this infantilization of them, but it was more heathen, like more pagan, and they made a lot of comparisons with the Romans and with the Greeks and with the Carthaginians, the pagan ones, I guess I should say. Like, yeah. They made a constant one-to-one examples, right? Like, these people were the Romans, these people were the Greeks of this new continent.
That's cool.
And they perceived them with the same infantilized view that they saw the heathens from Europe.
Yeah, I saw a number of so when you're reading through the sources, and I'll go more into this in our next Inca video that will actually be the Spanish conquest, but there are these constant in the conquistadors' journals, these constant allusions to these roads are greater than anything Alexander built, or they're completely stunned by what they're seeing because they would have never expected to find this here. They've completely underestimated the people of this region, and suddenly there are these accounts of rooms filled with gold and an entire garden with life-size figures of the emperor and the royal family made out of silver and gold. And they're just completely floored by what they're seeing. And they're trying to make sense of it. So I think in those cases, that what they refer to when they come across the Inca temples, religious temples, a number of them refer to them as mosques because they start to realize that, okay, well, this isn't a Christian church, but it seems like so built up in their mind to just sort of be, I don't know, a regular old heathen shrine or something. It's like, okay, maybe it's a mosque. And it is really interesting. You can see this contact is so jarring to them that they're just trying to find whatever terms they can to understand this or to make sense in their own worldview. One of the things that really I found really interesting was that they were kind of looking through as they were learning the Inca religion or sort of shared folklore that existed throughout the Andes. There was some story in the past about a long time ago, there had been this dark period in the earth, and however many cataclysmic events had happened. And so the person writing this down had speculated. He said, we believe that this was when Christ was crucified, and that's why everything got dark. And so they had no idea what it was, but that's clearly how we make sense of their story, which I just thought was so interesting. I love when you have these completely clashing worldviews, and how does one worldview change to accommodate the next one?
And it is interesting when I remember looking into Columbus's contact narrative, and at one point he believed that he had found the long-lost Garden of Eden. And then there also was kind of this framing that he would do when he's writing back to the Spanish crown, that these people maybe are, in some sense, Edenic people or something, like you said, kind of naive, innocent. They have no shame, kind of like pre-fall. And you can also see how that was him dressing things up politically too, because essentially what he's trying to do is say these would be great potential Spanish subjects. So we're gonna try to frame them in a way that they might be kind of proto-Christian, but they're not Christian yet. But I just thought that's interesting when you do see those, like you said, just interpreting it that they must be Muslim, or maybe they are some type of pre-fallen people, and they have a potential to be Christian, and maybe they live in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic, the one that both of you brings, because as the Spaniards and later Europeans arrived to the continent, it was a struggle to make sense of this quote unquote new world within the context of a biblical creation, right? Because to their mind, Jesus had already been born, he had sacrificed himself. The three major religions, or the two rather, I guess, Christianity and its subsects, and Islam and its subsects, and the Jewish faith, were all based on this Abrahamic belief, right? All together, whether they thought of it as heretic or not. They were very much thinking of themselves as living in a post-Christian world, a post-Christ world, despite the obvious intrusions of pagan-ish groups like the Mongols and so forth. But they understood it within the context of this old world. So to come into contact with a people that they had no idea how they even came to be, that they had not learned of the teachings of Christ, or they knew nothing of Islam, of Jews, or of nothing. It was a shake to their core views of the world, and they tried to explain it in a lot of ways. Obviously, they tried to explain that the physical material world, what they were seeing through different analogies. Like Chris speaks about the mosques and the temples. They talk about the subject in different ways and according to what they're used to, what they've seen, versus what they're seeing at the moment. So they call them mosques, they call them kus, which I think is a Caribbean term. They call them temples too, sanctuaries. Like they're trying to kind of conceptualize. They even call them pyramids that early on, making allusions to the pyramids of Egypt for those that had seen them at some point. They make a lot of comparisons, like the plaza, the internal market of Tlatelolco. They draw comparisons to the plaza in Sevilla, that they were around the same size, like these gigantic monuments to public engagement, right? So they're trying to find these analogies, and with regards to the perception of the indigenous people, like they're also trying to find explanations to why they exist in this state, I guess, whether it be like this idyllic Eden-esque hunter-gatherer lifestyle, or if this Roman Greek parallel. Like even as early on as the 1530s, you have people like saying that they might have been descendants of the Phoenicians from Carthage. Some say that they were one of the tribes of Israel that found their way all the way over there, which I think is a central tenet of modern day Mormonism or something. And
I think today too, they come from a lost advanced civilization, according to Netflix.
I mean, even in the 1600s, if I recall correctly, there is an early version of the Asian migration. Like they spot these similarities between the East Asian or Indonesian or Southeast Asian peoples with the Colombian peoples, the American peoples. And one of them does go so far as to say that they came from Asia, right? So you have these people trying to make sense of the continent, of its people, of its different stages of civilization and culture and society, and trying to make sense of it within this framework, and making like endless comparisons and analyses.
Yeah, there's something interesting I came across, and I'll mention more of it in there's an exclusive Patreon video I'll do, kind of just on some bonus information on the Inca. But there was a theory that I came across from the early 1800s that theorized that the Mongols actually conquered the Americas. So the Mongol attempted invasion of Japan in 1281, gets knocked off course by the tsunami, hurricane. And according to this person writing in the early 1800s, he publishes a book about the Mongol conquest of the Americas. And he says, okay, well, this, you can look back, like the legendary founder king of the Incas called Manco Capac. He said, no, his name is Mongol Capac. And that's why, and there was another name too, I think early in Aztec, but he was saying, okay, well, this explains why you have, in his mind, these states that are organized like these Chinese or East Asian states, and they're very advanced and very civilized in the author's mind. And he said, okay, well, this makes sense of why there was nothing in the Americas up until like 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. There was nothing else going on, which I feel like is actually still kind of a bit of an implicit assumption now, that if you say, okay, well, what are the built up civilizations that left these great ruins for us? What are the metropolises that the Americas produce pre-Columbus? Obviously, I've never met anybody who believes the Mongols conquered America, but people would say, okay, well, look, it's the Aztecs and Incas, and maybe the Mayas or something. But so I felt like this was kind of a natural segue to talk a little bit about some of that pre-Columbian, very ancient civilizations. So I'll bring on, there was Cahokia. So these are ruins kind of around the Mississippi, present day US. And Rafael, you did a wonderful depiction of Cahokia in its prime. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about it and what goes into this, what your research was like, if somebody's unfamiliar with this.
Right. That Cahokia illustration was part of a series, or rather is part of a series. It's not the only one I've done in the Mississippi of the Cahokia reconstruction. It's an interesting settlement, just in general. it's actually it's neither that young nor that old as a settlement. It's from the 11th century, if I recall correctly, and it's stretched. Might even be from the 10th century, and finally started its decline towards the 12th, if I recall correctly. And it's an interesting topic, the whole Mississippian area, just like in general, because for at least the continental U.S., you do have this impression that North America was just teepees and people in the plains, small groups of subsistent farmers. But it wasn't really the case. With regards to the Mississippi, we have a lot of cultural areas. We have the Hopewell culture, the mound builders, people like that they were kind of like in a state of, let's call them proto-chiefdoms, like weren't quite states per se, at least as far as we're able to tell, but were congregating in larger and larger numbers. And at one point, like it seems to have all coalesced for some reason in the great city of Cahokia. Now, how that happened or why, we're not entirely sure. The mound building tradition was very ancient in North America, but the specific style of the mound builder societies post-Mississippi, like post-Cahokian, was a very Mesoamerican in nature to some extent. And there have been increasingly older sites in the Mississippi from the South, from Georgia, from Alabama, from the general southern area, that seem to suggest, to some degree, that some sort of cultural expansion was coming from the South towards the North. So while Cahokia might have been the maximum expression of Mississippian ethnogenesis, to say a term, it might have started with the coalescence of cultures from the South, from Mesoamerica, with the mound builders of the southern U.S. That seems to be one of the broadly accepted assumptions, because it is ultimately an assumption. We don't know yet, but that seems to be more or less the case. Now, Cahokia in question kind of seems to have exploded around the 10th century. It started as a smaller settlement, and now it's known for its palisade, pentagonal, I think, in shape. But at the time, like that was a fairly late development, and it, like, at its peak, at the peak site, it was around 60,000 people, 35,000 centered around the Palisade district, but extended throughout there's a lake there, the Horseshoe Lake, that connects to St. Louis, Missouri nowadays. The whole area was settled. Like it's a shame I can't actually show you the eagle-eyed view of the site yet, but the whole city like extends all the way to St. Louis from the modern day national park to the city.
Wow.
So it was gigantic, and it made itself known throughout the Mississippi, because we see a lot of settlements that seem to have been directly linked. We don't know what the nature of that link was, if it was vassalage, if it was colonies, if it was copycat settlements or whatever. But we do know that they appeared with and after Cahokia. And we also see fortifications, especially towards the later half of the city's growth. Typically, with the assumption, the speculation right now, as far as I know, is that it is a response to Algonquian and Iroquoian, or Iroquoian, because Haudenosaunee are specific people within the Iroquoian language branch. But from expansion from the north, and they seem to have engaged in a lot of conflicts with these people. And towards the 12th century, you start seeing a decline in Cahokia. We don't know. Again, we don't know why. We don't know if it has anything to do with with the mini ice age from the Middle Ages. It might have been to do with that, might have been to do with failing crops. We're not sure. The city might have simply overextended its capabilities as a settlement, but it eventually declined. But what happened as a result of it, ironically, was an explosion of petty kingdoms that were born from it. And from its decline, we see a bunch of minor, and I use minor in quotations, minor Mississippian states, because they were pretty large, that came from the fragmentation of Cahokian imperial power, quote unquote. We don't know the nature of their influence. So from the 12th century onwards until the arrival of De Soto, you see this political fragmentation and this competing state of warfare and cultural development in the Mississippi, with influences from the west, from the east, from the southwest, Hopi Pueblo area. We do see some mercantile objects in the Mississippian area that were presumably exported. And we do see some influence at the moment, mostly indirect, but increasingly heavier direct linkage to Mesoamerica, particularly the Gulf Coast. And like these states, because that's what they were, these states were nothing to scoff at. Like the whole area of the basin of the Mississippi was just riddled with kingdoms, with polities of all sorts. We don't know exactly their political configurations, but we know they were large. For example, one of the enemies that De Soto faced in his expedition, Kiwatam, I think, mustered, I think, around 10,000 canoes. With each canoe had an average of around 10 to 20, some even 50 people in the canoes. So these were large armies that were confronting each other, that were confronting the Spaniards when they arrived. And it speaks to a pretty large social and political development that was in the area. But they were already seeing a decline too that was sparked by, again, we can't say for sure, by ecological issues like problems, failing crops, constant warfare, and eventually the Spanish arrival, which more than cause any political disruption, it seems to have caused some kind of epidemiological is the term.
Yeah.
Disruption, which we don't know to what extent. Sometimes the whole germ theory is a bit overplayed, but it did seem to cause further struggles to an already declining area.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why the people that came after, like the French and the English, they didn't get to see the Mississippians in their splendor. They did see some, like the Natchez people, but not what the Spaniards saw, and certainly nothing to the extent of Cahokia at its prime.
Can you tell us what's...
go ahead, Joe.
Oh, sorry. Can you tell us what's going on in this painting? Or what you had in mind?
Sure. Right. So the research regarding this painting in particular, it comes from a lot of places, really. The outfits, in particular, of the Mississippians, in particular, just to point out that the guy with the cloth in his hand is supposed to be a Huasteca from Mesoamerica, from the Gulf Coast.
Wow. But
the rest are very much Mississippians. They are based on pottery, iconographic depictions, and gorget conch shells. They are depictions from copper laminates and ceramic figures, either facial, how do you call them? Head sculptures that give us ideas of their tattoos that they were wearing, as well as from the De Soto chronicles and from later chronicles from French and English explorers. that's in regards to their attire. Like there's a lot of different variations, and I can really go into each and every one of them. But just to give you like a general sense, a general view, in the architecture, the wattle and daub, the specific height and size of each of these little houses is based on archaeological evidence that we have of their kind of mass-produced they had a kind of mass-produced architecture where they dug out specific size holes and set up wattle and daub and towers in very I almost want to say kind of like an industrialized way, like they were built in a very specific, constant, uniform way, which is why you see these repeated constantly throughout the whole district. So we have that, and the construction type was maintained throughout the 15th, 16th, 17th century. The Natchez built houses similar to these. And at least in this painting in particular, you can see the Monk's Mount, or the Great Pyramid of Cahokia. And that is like a big yellow. I painted it. But that is based on soil examples we have of the site. We understand that it was covered, this mound and mounds in general in the Mississippian area were covered in specific clays with different colors that kind of represented cardinal directions and specific religious thoughts. And it was also like the clay that was available. And so you could see like giant red mounds, black mounds, different colored mounds. Sometimes they were painted artificially, but we have very little surviving evidence of those. And I did decide to go for a yellow monk's mound based on the large quantities of yellow clay that surround the superficial surviving remnants of the mound itself.
I think it's exactly the color of my wall.
I think it is, actually.
You're inside. And they're burning material. Something, it looks like. There's a fire.
Oh, yeah. That's a bit speculative. It's the Great Fire, the eternal fire, like the Mississippian people, even until the late 18th century, 19th century, had a concept of an eternal fire that they had to keep going. And this is just an extension of that idea. There are a lot of similar eternal fire rituals throughout the Americas. The Aztecs had a new fire ceremony. We think it's something similar to that, but we really don't have a ton of detail. It's a bit speculative in that sense.
I think when I was doing the research for our Osage one, there's some belief that the Osage, so their stories would say that they came from the Ohio River Valley and then migrated west in the preceding centuries before contact and had settled to what their homeland became. So now some reconstructions have them basically taking part in Cahokia. And so when I was doing the research for that and just sort of learning a little bit about Cahokia, I believe I came across a theory that was some idea that the artifacts that we see that are in Cahokia from very far away, in these places that we have historically viewed as maybe trade routes, and they could be from so far away, like East Coast United States. So we're saying, okay, well, what are you doing here? That perhaps they weren't veritable trade routes that were just constantly used, but maybe Cahokia was a place of pilgrimage. I don't know if you come across that, but as you were saying, the eternal fire thing, it was making me think that there must have been, I would guess, with many pyramids just all across the world, but there must have been some sort of spiritual significance to this place. And as so is often the case when you have a strong political power, you derive or claim some authority from divinity. I don't know if you had explored that at all, or you had come across that theory.
Well, it's a complicated subject and topic in particular. like regarding the ethnic composition of the city itself, we have hypotheses that it might have. Well, all cities are multi-ethnic, like by nature. That's just the way cities are built, just in general. So we have, I don't know if confirmed, but we know that it was likely inhabited by Tahigan people, by Cherokee. We're talking about the Ponca. Kind of, there's a group of people that are associated with the Mississippi, like the Natchez, the Cherokee, the Ponca, I can't think of others at the top of my head at the moment. But basically, they were all interrelated in some way. Like the Mississippian area, the Mississippian civilization, as it were, wasn't really like a culture in the way, say, the Aztecs were, but they were more in line, I guess, with Mesoamerica, like that kind of like a complex state with different ethnicities and different individualized cultures that all shared a common heritage. So with regards to like what the Osage may say regarding their own migrations, like I don't recall like the specificity of the claims of the Osage, but Mississippian people moved around a lot after the.
Yeah. Well, I was meaning more just
Mississippian.
I was meaning more just Cahokia as a place of pilgrimage. And I'll throw in, we have a message from the chat, Lucian, that is just sort of related. What do we know about the Mississippian religion? You know, is there some suggestion that Cahokia was this place of great religious significance, or maybe there were leaders here that claimed some divinity?
Right, but that is kind of the issue, though, I guess, with regards to the composition of the city, because the fact of the matter is that we don't actually have a lot of oral tradition that suggests anything about Cahokia. Like not from the Ponca, not from the Cherokee, not from any Mississippian surviving groups. Cahokia seems to have just kind of vanished from the collective consciousness. Cahokia specifically, not the Mississippian mountain towns and cities and whatnot. Like those were very still present, right? But the idea of this imperial center, or whatever importance Cahokia had at the time, well, we simply don't know why it ceased to have it after 3 or 4 centuries after its decline. We do have some idea of what might have happened, in the sense that with the conflicts born between the Iroquoian and Algonquian peoples, and the birth of Cahokia, just as a concept in general, as an imperial settlement, a lot of political paradigms might have been born from it. It has been suggested on occasion that the autocracy born from Cahokia, or that coalesced in Cahokia to its maximum extent, was a driving factor in the oligarchic or republican tendencies of the Iroquoian people. So like kind of like a back and forth between these two groups because of that. So you see that influence there. But as to whether it was a pilgrimage site, as to whether it was political or religiously important at any point after its decline, we can't really say, because we don't have a ton of information about the Mississippians post-Cahokia, as in regards to their stories or their myths or their legends. What we have is stories of the Mississippians after the Mississippian civilization, after the collapse, after European intrusion. And we don't have much of Cahokia in that sense. By the time the Spaniards, the French or the English passed by, the city was completely like forgotten. Nobody made any mention of it. None of the scouts brought it up. So it's hard to say. Like my instinct would be that the Mississippian settlements that spurred from Cahokia probably drew lineage from it, drew political legitimacy, because that's something that very much happened with Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica, but we can't really say for sure. And regarding Mississippian religion, we also don't have a clear idea, because it's modified so much from what it used to be by European intrusion, by the collapse, that we can't really say. We have some idea that they had gods, that they had this idea of the eagle man kind of mixed. We have some iconographic elements. We have the serpent and the spider associated with weaving, but we don't have any specificity, unfortunately, like we do in Mesoamerica. We just have kind of vague concepts and ideas that we can kind of link to modern religious tradition, but that is already very Christianized.
Yeah, no, I think, well, I did have something on surviving structures. Maybe we could look at some stuff that we have a little bit more firm footing on, in terms of this is closer to contact. This was Joe's depiction. I'll show Raphael's as well. But Sacsayhuaman is the enormous cyclopean walls that we aren't really entirely sure how they were built. Don't say aliens. It wasn't aliens. It was something, but it wasn't aliens. But you can see, so we do have depictions of Incas pulling these enormous boulders here. There's that quote from the Spaniard who said that no man believes, or nobody who sees them believes that the hand of man could have placed these here. And so one of the big challenges when we're looking at these is you can see how enormous these are. And we aren't really sure. Here's a current day festival that happens. Look how it's ridiculous how big this is.
Yeah.
These are several tons. And they are fitted, most of them are fitted to where they say that you cannot fit a knife's blade in between them. So the big challenge is you could roll it up there and you could try to fit it. But if it doesn't fit perfectly and it's not completely flush, what do? How do you get it off and then make a modification, put it back? There's a number of theories. We do know in terms of cutting, they did have some metal or they used other stone, and they also used wedges, so natural break points in the rock. And then reportedly, they would stick wood into there and then pour water on it so it started to expand against the rock. But here was Raphael's depiction as well. I thought was really cool. Of course, we have the big tower in the middle there. Did you want to add anything about what you found at Sacsayhuaman?
Yeah, about Sacsayhuaman, like sometimes a big impression is made about how you can pass a knife or paper through the different stone seams. And while I can't really go on much about the construction methodology, I will say like that is very superficial. As in, like, once you go a little bit beyond that plaster quality from the outside and actually look at how the rocks connect inside, they're actually not that finely placed. There's a lot of sticking dirt in the little crevices, to fill in the space. Like it's very superficial. It's not as spectacular as sometimes people make it seem. Like it's Lego pieces.
So the aliens put the dirt in between them, right?
Right. Like they put the little rocks in between the crevices. But what I will say, that site is like very impressive. It's very monumental in scale and size. Like regardless, what survives now aren't really the walls of the site as it's by itself, but rather the what do you call the basement?
Like the
foundation. Exactly.
Spanish has taken a lot of it.
Right. You can see the foundation. Like that's what I tried to do in this depiction, is to show like the large stone walls are the foundation, and the walls that are on top, the ones that are defensive in purpose, are much smaller, much more in line with just your average like wall in general. Some of these I covered in plaster, in clay plaster, which was common a common sight in Cusco and in general in this area of the Andes in general, which is sometimes lost with this impression. It happens a lot all around the world with Rome and with China, with the Americas in particular. Like you see these remnants that are devoid of color and devoid of decoration, and that's what you think of these ancient sites as they might have been in their prime. But realistically, we have a lot of evidence for clay covering, for plaster, for murals, and for just a very richly colored and decorated structure.
Do you think it was
So
mostly
that's
an aesthetic thing? Plastering was mostly aesthetic, or did it have a practical purpose?
It was definitely aesthetic. Now, I put some on the walls because there might have been evidence, and because some societies in different parts of the world did plaster their defensive walls because the plaster hid the seams of the stone, and therefore you couldn't, say, construct sage equipment based on calculations of the size. Like you couldn't get a good estimate of the wall size without getting close enough to get showered by arrows. So that was the idea of plastering the walls sometimes, but it didn't really happen all the time, or wasn't that often. So who knows how effective that was really. But why I did add plaster on these walls was because Sacsayhuaman is very much a kind of a ego project, I guess, by the Inca. It's defensively very impressive, obviously gigantic in size, and it covers an important strategic area. But by the time the Spanish had arrived, there wasn't really anybody that would threaten Cusco from that specific area. So they weren't really super useful. They were more status oriented. They were more trying to project
imperial power and a fortress.
Exactly. It's very much the head of the jaguar in regards to, like, Sacsayhuaman's placed on a hill and shaped in a puma, not a jaguar. And the main walled portion of Cusco has the body of a puma lying down. And obviously the actual city extended far beyond the walls, but that is like its purpose. It's the head of the state. It's the head of the puma. It's the administrative and religious center, the status display of the Incan supremacy. That is the purpose of Sacsayhuaman, and that is what I was trying to illustrate in this otherwise mostly kind of video game focused type of artwork.
Yeah, this was you can see. So this was Joe's depiction of Cusco, right, and you can see there's that head of the puma. So that's supposed to be Sacsayhuaman, and then you have the rest of it here. Just the planned portion of the city was apparently in that shape, and then you had people just for miles and miles settling across. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to show, what do I have else here? Was just some of the roads I thought were the most impressive thing about the Incas, arguably. 25,000 miles of road. That is more than the circumference of the earth, which is kind of ridiculous.
More roads than Rome ever built too, I believe.
But you know, I think it has some parallels too. I had Joe do some of the aqueducts there, which blew my mind as well, just learning there was sort of a built-up system of the spring water would go through the aqueducts and reach the royal bath first. So people are in the comments comparing it to Rome and stuff. And in Rome, you see a similar, just completely astonishing use of water in a way that we hadn't previously considered. But I think with the roads and the aqueducts, so I think it's always important when we're looking at these things built by the Aztec, Mayans, Incas, that they aren't coming out of nowhere. You know, but there's very little. It would be more absurd to say that there were a slew of 20 super useful inventions or infrastructure that came about in the 13th or 14th century or something like that. I thought this was amazing. So this is Cumbe Mayo, a series of aqueducts that are in the Andes from 1600 BC. So this is not, these are not technologies that were just figured out then. These are things that were built up year over year. You saw in our video, the Moche had extremely advanced art and innovations. The Temple of the Sun, I believe it is, in the Moche civilization, that has something over 40 million bricks inside of it, which is just the same thing with these are projects that would have required years and years in some sort of systematized expectation and supply of labor that keeps going back. So I just thought, I would guess that there's a lot that you encounter as well when you're studying Mesoamerican history, Rafael, that trying to give people a sense that these are not innovations just from the Aztecs or Mayans, that these civilizations didn't come out of nowhere. Are there other sites across Mesoamerica that come to mind, just thinking about, I guess, much more ancient structures that maybe aren't that well known?
Tons, actually. Like you do make a good point. Much is said about the Incan roads, but the fact of the matter is that a pretty strong portion of them were probably predate the Incas themselves.
Yeah.
Were built by previous societies that lived in the valley and outside.
That were already used. And
exactly.
Paved a portion of them or something.
Exactly that. And yeah, like you said, like these societies, we treat them as ancient because we don't know the history of them, and we don't know this long legacy that was in the continental Americas. But they were actually the very last of a long line of civilizations and a long line of infrastructural developments that they inherited. In Mesoamerica, we do have evidences of waterways, of drainage, of aqueducts as early as, I think, 1300 BCE.
Wow.
From the Olmecs in Veracruz. We have the pipes that led fresh water from Chapultepec, which is a mountain in central basin of Mexico, that led it to Tenochtitlan. That is the foundation for the aqueducts that the Spanish built and later the Mexican government used until Mexico City became unmanageable. And it's hard to go into it because there is so much, really, so much that we sometimes assume that the Americans did not have. For example, the True Arch did exist in Mesoamerica, at least. We have several surviving examples of it. Just to give an example, right? We have roads similar to those of the Inca. We have the Sac Bay that connected city-states in the Yucatan, the Mayan city-states. There was, I don't know what the term, postal service, like there was a connection of communication routes, right? Between the different city-states, between the different regions, between the different continents, right? Like there was a question in the live chat about the trade routes in the Americas. So like we have a ton going from Ecuador into Mesoamerica, from the Gulf Coast to the Mississippi, from central Mexico to southwest US, and from southwest US to the Mississippi and to the west coast. And from the Andes, like it's even worse. Like we have it into the Amazon, into the southern plains, we have into Ecuador, things like that. So there's just so much information really regarding infrastructure and regarding architecture that to discuss that was inherited by the Mexica, to the Mexica rather, from previous civilizations and from exterior civilizations, from foreign ones, and from complex mix of ideas. It's hard to get into, really, just speaking generally.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples is there is a residential palace in Texcoco that was for the exclusive use of the king Nezahualcóyotl and his progeny afterwards. That had direct linkage. That had its own aqueduct from springs from a nearby mountain, and it's an impressive structure and a high mountain hill that oversaw the kingdom of the Aqualhua, which is what the kingdom of Texcoco was, one of the 3 branches of the Aztec Empire.
Is this it?
That Texcoco, it's hard to find an example. If you can find,
these are all bad reconstructions.
I'm gonna put it in the chat, in the private chat, because I can't.
Okay.
Right. Let's see if you can find it. If not, I'll Google it real quick.
Oh, okay.
Texcoco. It's Texcoco. Okay.
There we go.
There's a reconstruction done by an archaeologist, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it. If not, I'll link it so you can share.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay, here it is, I think. I'll share it in a bit.
But yeah, I mean, this is, I guess the broad point is it's very easy to assume what are the big
I sent it.
metropolis civilizations. Okay, let me open it up. But what are the big metropolis civilizations? And the reason why we immediately think Incas, Aztecs, is because those are the ones that we have the most written information about. But we're only privileging that in our minds because of that historical incidence. And if contact had happened 200 years prior or 200 years later, there would very well be another civilization that we're talking about. Go, oh, wow, that's the peak civilization. And you would hear a lot less about the Incas or the Aztecs.
Exactly. You can share the image now. I shared you a reconstruction of that particular palace.
Okay. There we go. Wow. Looks kind of Greek in this. It's like an Acropolis.
It does a little bit. That's a palace. Like at the bottom, you can see a part of the city of Texcoco and a lake reconstruction of the lake of Texcoco.
That's cool.
And it's not the only type of these structures. There is a temple structure located at the top. There are like 3 temple structures located at the top of 3 different mountains in the surrounding region that are all pretty interesting, architecturally fascinating. There's actually a funny story that reminds me of the Greeks in a lot of ways. There's this temple to the rain god, Tlaloc, and he's located on a mountain called the Tlalocaltepec, and it's in a disputed region between the city-state of Texcoco, the city-state of Tlaxcala, and the city-state of Huejotzingo. And so these 3 went to war all the time before they were assimilated by the Aztec Empire, with the extension of Tlaxcala. And when these 3 went to war, they captured part of the region that held this temple, and they climbed up the mountain, and they broke the idol of the god that the other had built, put a new one, and gave new offerings to it. And then they held it for a while, and then eventually they'd lose the war again, and the other party would climb up, remove the idol, put their own offerings, and so forth. And it was constantly disputed. And even in the colonial period, because rain and water distribution was always a conflict between these 3, even well into the Republican era, you kind of still see that little bit of infighting between who gets to own and who gets to offer and who gets to take care of this particular structure, which reminds me a lot of what the ancient Greeks used to do with the Temple Olympia and so forth. Sending shields and putting little FUs to their rival states in an otherwise neutral ground.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to touch on one last point, and then we'll let you go here. But one thing that I was interested in, so you live in the Yucatan, correct?
There are also a few questions here that probably worth answering.
Okay.
But yeah, go for it.
I can bring them up on screen. But
the Nazca one is interesting if you want to. Saw that one.
But you were saying, Chris.
So yeah, I can go to that point in the presentation, but just looking at some maybe enduring practices. So, it can be very easy to think of these as kind of lost civilization, lost customs, but in many ways it seems, in just my experience studying the Andes here, that there's a lot of enduring culture or something that maybe has become syncretized in a way. But so one of the depictions that Joe made was something that would be some sort of festival in. So this could be Inti Raymi festival, the Sun Festival for the Incas, and some of those depictions were based on. And you can see the llamas coming to be slaughtered there and sacrificed, but they are based on the continuing Inti Raymi festival that still happens there today in Cusco. I wonder, are there analogs to that in Mesoamerica or the Yucatan?
There's actually a fair bit, and it's a complex and interesting subject because one does have to separate between like neo-pagan religious ceremonies and syncretized Catholic pagan ceremonies, which are two different things. In Mexico, in particular, and you see a lot of it in the U.S. from migrant groups and so forth that try to reincorporate Aztec thoughts, quote unquote. And it's kind of similar to what you see in Europe and others. Like they try to revive these ancient religions by what their texts supposedly say, but with modern concepts and Western ideas and so forth. So those I'm kind of iffy about. Like I could go into the topic further, but as to your question, as to syncretized, there's actually a lot. It's even been suggested several times that a lot of Mexico, outside of the urban centers that are more modernized or westernized or whatever term you prefer, isn't really Catholic in a really definable sense. Like it's more Indo-Christian, Indo-Mesoamerican. And I say this because not only are many practices still alive from the pre-Columbian period, just with a Catholic flavor, like even sacrifice is still very much practiced. We didn't go into the topic of human sacrifice, for example, but the last registered human sacrifice was like in the 40s, if I recall correctly. And there's the sacrifice of animals is still extremely common, like sacrifice bulls. There's an interesting particular tradition of a bull sacrifice that very much resembles the sacrifice of warriors captured in battle, for example. But beyond that, there's a lot of syncretism of ancient practices that are repeated just under different names, like the worship of Tlaloc continues fairly heavily under the Saint Miguelito. And even
we lost you for a second. Yeah, if he's coming back, I can show. We did get one question here: were any of these temples repurposed into Christian churches after the conquest? One of the really cool ones is a convent of Santo
I got disconnected a little bit.
Yeah, you did for a second. I'll just continue the thought here. So this is a convent in Cusco built on the Coricancha Temple of the Sun. And so this is all Spanish above There's religious architecture, a chapel on the other side, and you have an original Inca wall that was just preserved below it. Which, yeah, it's just. I'll let you get back to your thought. That was my my little escape pouch. once you lost connection.
Fill the awkward silence. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, well, basically, my point was that while state religion, in a very public manner, was for the most part eradicated. Like I'm talking about public expressions of religious culture and state state ceremonies and so forth were largely replaced by Catholic tradition. Most personal, individual religious thought was kept throughout the centuries and is still very much alive. Still very much Mesoamerican. I still treat this area as Mesoamerican. Like there's a colonial Mesoamerican period and a Republican Mesoamerican period is what I treat it as. So the religions are very much alive. They're just morphed. They're just partially Catholic. It varies from region to region, from area to area, some more than others. In the Yucatan, there's a lot of variety in that sense. There's a specific place that still worships its dead and still exhumes people for their parading and so forth. And you see examples of that all the time. Like I could go on and name specific examples, but just to give you like a general view of the area. And regarding temple structures and churches, in Mexico at least, in Mexico there are many temples that were left alone that just decayed on their own. Some still conserve the upper temple of the pyramid. Others were repurposed. You see that in the Temple of Cholula, the Great Temple of Cholula. You see the Great Pyramid that has mostly been deteriorated since before the Catholics arrived, but was repurposed above because of its sacred nature into a church. And there are others where the temple was entirely dismantled and its pieces were used to build a church in its place. Typically not on the temple directly, because some feared that they would just use the Catholic temple for pagan religious practices. So the idea was to move the geographic area of worship so that these types of connection didn't happen, but they still did. So there are a lot of little examples I could show of that, but there's a lot of syncretism, a lot of practices that maintain that half millennia on them that can be traced all the way back to the Olmecs. And they're hidden like in plain sight. We just don't really think of them for the most part, or even people here in Mexico just see them as completely normal and part of life, and don't really analyze that these are practices that go back millennia.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think
basically
there's a level of beyond doctrinal persistence. Maybe you don't literally believe in these gods anymore, but there are just enduring cultural artifacts or modes of thinking. So in doing a lot of the Andean research, this idea of reciprocity had existed among them for a very long time. And so that was kind of sometimes characterized as exploited by the Incas, but I think you also have every right to believe that the Incas also followed reciprocity and felt like this was a legitimate example of it. But the Incas are granting you the safety of their empire and access to certain storehouses, aid in times of famine. And in return, you pay the mitma tax. You give us labor every single year. And that plays on a reciprocity, but if you look further into it as well, so that the Incas, like many cultures, just believe that the world is suffused with the divine, whether it's ancestor spirits or spirits kind of in great natural formations. And so there's also an idea among them that you would have to take care of the earth and watch the earth, and then the earth will provide for you, whether that's through agriculture or, if you don't abuse the earth, there will be less natural disasters or things of that sort. And the author was talking about how this still persists in the Andean region. So, you would go do something for a neighbor, and you don't need to tell your neighbor that, oh yeah, remember when I did this time for you? It's expected at some point that this happens. And so these are ideas that predate the Incas, persisted through colonization, and still exist today.
I'd like to bring up some of the questions that were, because we mostly spoken between ourselves, and I'd like to quickly address them before we end the stream.
Guys, we've been talking too much. I see there's quite a few here.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna just quickly pass through a few that caught my interest. Firstly is the use of metallurgy. The Incas, yes, the Andeans did know metallurgy for a while. So do the Mesoamericans, but they learned it later on, like around the 11th centuries, where it really starts picking up. But by the time of Spanish arrival, bronze was already well known and well practiced. Just wasn't especially common. The Aztecs did knew about it. The Aztecs did use it for tools. It just wasn't especially valued. It was valued, just not a tremendous amount. The Incas used it also, but sometimes their use is overstated a little bit. It's not too dissimilar from what you see in Mesoamerica. So for that, that's from Gomez. The other question, let's see. Here he's Chronicles and Curiosities talking about the trade routes in pre-Columbian America. And I did bring that up already, but we know of several trade routes. Some are directly alluded to. Some are still used. I mentioned from the Andes to Mesoamerica, you had the Pacific coastline, which is where they traded to. We have direct evidence of material culture from Ecuador, making its way all the way to Michoacan in Mexico, and it probably went further north. We have evidence of the Yucatan engaging with Central America and the upper Amazon and the Caribbean. I'm talking about Jamaica, I'm talking about Cuba, I'm talking about the whole area. We have the Gulf Coast with the Mississippi. That one's more speculative, but we do have evidence that's indirect, but that suggests some sort of connection. And just the indirect evidence is already too strong by itself. We just need to basically to dig more. And we also have direct evidence of Mesoamerica with the Southwest, chocolate, parrots, like turquoise, between the Pueblos, between the Aztecs, between the Tarascans, and from Southwest to the West Coast and the East Coast, the Mississippi, the Algonquians, the Iroquois. The whole continent was basically a giant net of trade routes. Everywhere led everywhere else. There wasn't this one single, in quotation, single, like the Silk Road, but there were like several different ways. That has to do a lot with the geography of the continent. So on that account, yeah, the pre-Columbian America was extremely well connected. We have tales of people like Moncactabe, which traveled the whole of the continental US from the east to west coast. And we have examples of the Ecuadorians and so forth.
And maize, I believe, spread from Mesoamerica all throughout the Andes and just became a staple crop.
Right, maize, chocolate, potato spread from South America to the Polynesia. I think sweet potato. We have a lot of that. Okay. What else? The thing about the Chachapoyas, like, no, they weren't blonde or red-haired. I think the Spaniards at one point say they were of white skin or clear skin, but that needs to be taken in context. Like, it wasn't white, or their concepts of race, even back then, wasn't really the same as the concept of race now, or even the concept of race in the 17th or 18th century. Like, when they talk about white, they sometimes refer to Mesoamerican people themselves as white or white skin, which basically just means not black or not very dark skin, like it's very dual. But it's very rare. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. There was also a lot of tone variation in the skin and appearance of indigenous people. That's something that I didn't bring up, but there is a ton of genetic variation. We treat Native Americans as a single people, as a single group, but there is as much variety in both continents as there is in Europe and Asia and Africa. They look broadly the same, I guess, because they're all brown, some tonal variation of brown skin, but realistically, even their facial configurations are different. Their genetic makeup are different. Like, they have a shared heritage, sure, but they are different people. So you expect to see different variations of these people
and they
in
didn't
accordance
view
to
themselves as the same people either. You know, they had very different beliefs and rivalries and stuff like that. I think one of the really interesting things is, as the Incas are penetrating the Amazon, how they grapple with these vastly different beliefs and customs. And there is this account I'd shared in our Discord chat before of Tupac Yupanqui, his second expedition into the Amazon. And he's kind of taken aback that nobody's wearing clothes. So he gives them tunics, and then they wear the Inca tunics because he thinks that they should. And then they take them off the next day when he sees them, and he just starts laughing. And it's just like, it was a way of just realizing, okay, well, like, these ideas and customs varied so greatly between these people. And as you say, the same diversity, or I guess variety of political organization that existed in Europe or Asia or Africa also existed in the Americas.
Yeah, we have like full autocracies, absolute autocracies, partial autocracies. We see republics. We see partial republics, oligarchies, all types of stuff from the political angle, and culturally and genetically. There's a ton of variation, an absolute ton. You can't really speak in generalities of indigenous people in any real particular way that's fair to them. Okay, so another question is from Lucian. So what about the Mayan classical period? They left out of writing, and they did. They left a ton of writing. The lingua franca at the time, because what we think of Mayan people is kind of a term that's modern. Like, back in the day, while they did share commonalities and see themselves having a shared heritage, they didn't really think of themselves as Maya. They were more of their respective city-states, or even of their respective ethno-linguistic groups. And the lingua franca at the time was Chol, I think, Chota, or Chot, or something of the sort. And we do have a lot of information from written records. Unfortunately, their method of record keeping wasn't narrative-based, as it was. Like, they sometimes say Herodotus is the father of history because of his specific way of telling stories. That wasn't really the case, as far as we know, in the Maya, though there are some thoughts to be had about that. So we have more record keeping in a more anal way, in the years so-and-so King Bakal was raised, and he declared war on these guys, and he won, and then he lost, and then he won again, and then he built this, and then he built that, and then he died, and then his son, and so forth. So that's kind of like the history and the records we have. So based on that, we can actually like make a timeline and identify wars and campaigns and political reactions and conflicts, but we can't really say, for example, the relationship that Pakal had with his son, or the personal relationships between the king of Calakmul and the king of I don't know, Tikal, for example, or the triple alliance of Uxmal and Mayapan. So it's very political, very, very anal, very not so narrative focused, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, you always have to look at the context and the audience of something. So, like, a lot of the Inca royal histories are just going to be, for example, just for the royals. It's like you're preserving who's the legitimate ruler, and you're leaving out the rivals and things like that. And so, Yeah, I think that's probably a similar case there. It's like there's a specific context that these histories are being produced in.
Yeah. Same thing with the Romans, when like you have like Nero and Caligula, and all the histories on them, you kind of have to take with a grain of salt, even though they were exceptionally cruel people. But there's like a lot of stuff about like, well, did he really do that? Did he really, go after his sister in that way?
Right. Which isn't to say that these narratives and stories didn't exist, because we know they did. I mentioned before the Mexican Chronicles. There we have a very narrative depiction of Aztec history, and we have attitudes and ideas and personal relationships that go beyond these basic record keepings. So oral tradition definitely played a part, and it's a significant part of American history. Okay. Is there any evidence of people from Mesoamerica and Cahokia? Not direct evidence. We have evidence of Mesoamericans engaging with the Mississippians from the south, from southern continental U.S., but nothing to say of, let's say, we found bones from the Huasteca in Cahokia. On the painting, that's speculative on my part. It's not unreasonable. Like I said, most cities are multi-ethnic in nature. In Mesoamerica, you certainly had neighborhoods and districts for foreigners, specifically from Michoacan, from Veracruz, from the Yucatan. It's famously, Teotihuacan had a Mayan neighborhood, a Mayan district, from which they played like political engineers in the Yucatan. So it's not unreasonable that Cahokia had something similar, and that might have had traders from as far south as Mesoamerica or from far west as California. But we don't have much evidence at the moment for it.
Yeah, and a lot of these artistic depictions are just going to be educated guesses. What is a probable way something looked, or who could probably be here? Farther you go down, the murkier it is, the more estimations you're making.
Yeah. And Brigu Batra is asking how many people were in Cahokia at the time. The estimates is around 40,000 in the nucleus of the district of Cahokia. I'm talking about the Palisade and surrounding the Palisade. If you include the rest of the city that goes as far as St. Louis, it's estimated at 60,000, including some of the towns that are directly linked, like the municipalities, let's call them, of Cahokia. It's around 60, so between 40 and 60,000 people, which is pretty much the largest city in continental U.S. until Philadelphia in the 1800s.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Wow.
Okay. See if there's any other question that I can answer. Nathan Eric asked who built the huge mud brick pyramids in South America. I think you already answered that, Chris. What's the Moche?
Yeah, there's some really huge Moche ones, millions of bricks. You just think, kind of like Sacsayhuaman. It's reported to have begun under Pachacuti, but then just continued under his successors. And then there's accounts of, 20,000 people being brought in to help build it. But that would have been a continuous thing. And so anytime you have millions and millions of bricks, just think about how many hours are involved in that. So these are kind of like the Egyptian pyramids. These are things that just takes years and years and years. And, sometimes the people who started it don't get to see it finished, which I think is just incredible. These are amazing monuments. So any other questions you saw?
Just a few more, just a couple more, and if we can end things. Lucian asked about the Tarascan Empire, if there's anything about it to discuss, and there's a lot, to be honest. Make a full video about them, but I just wanted to answer this one in particular because I'm doing an illustration, a full on oil painting about them, and I wanted to mention it particular to you guys because the story that I'm illustrating, the historical scene I'm illustrating rather, is very reminiscent about your story about Pachacuti and Tupac, in that the historical scene I'm illustrating is of the founder of the kingdom, whose name is Tayakuri. His son, Kuratame, is going to take over the kingdom, the city-state of Pátzcuaro, and he is a drunken fool. He's aggressive. He's constantly just gambling and drinking and spending his time with women. And Tayakuri gives him a lot of chances to pick up his act together, because he is a very devout and a very aggressive, angry man. So he gives him a lot of chances, all said and done. But ultimately, he crosses the line when he punches his father in the face in a drunken stupor, after which Tayakuri decides that enough is enough. And he tells his nephews, who themselves have their own full story of rags to riches, who are Tangashoan and Hiripan, who are themselves famous because they and their brother, and the brother of Kuratame, the third son of Tayakuri, who is called Hikingahe, would form the triple alliance of the cities of Tzintzuntzan, Pátzcuaro, and Iguazio, which would form the Tarascan Empire that would later face on against the triple alliance of the Aztecs. And he basically charges his nephews and his third son to kill Kuratame, kill him, and take their place ruling those specific cities. So that's the illustration I'm going to do, and it's kind of one of those almost Shakespearean or biblical like stories about patricide, about the tragedy of patricide.
Yeah. It seems like you could make a good HBO series on that.
You could. It's very dramatic, and the whole story about the Tarascan Empire is very dramatic itself. And there's a lot of conflicts, a lot of stories. There's battles and wars fought between them and the Aztecs and other people that are worth bringing up.
Yeah, universal human stories. Love that stuff.
Okay, let's see if there's anything else. Tupiku Batra, yeah, people still worship ancestor worship, still bring out mummified people. It's not as common a practice anymore, but it still happens. And I think that's about it.
All right.
Just to say hi to Soma. But yeah.
Hi, Soma. Yeah, so before you guys jump off, what you have to do today, legally, I think it is the law, you need to go follow Rafael on social media. I put the links down in the description. Instagram, Twitter, or X, whatever it's called. And then if you want to support him, you should support him. I have his Patreon link down in the description. And again, if you want to come to Ireland with us, it's going to be a magical trip. So we have the link in the description there. Thank you guys for joining. Thanks for the great questions. And thanks for joining us, Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'd be happy to join in future.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. See you, everyone.